I had a interview with a new friend, Nathan Thompson, on his podcast. One of the things he asked was about, analytical meditation, self-inquiry. And I said, just ask yourself, who am I? And analyze that, and go, see where it takes you. And then he said, well, that's a Hindu meditation. And of course, that really got me going. Let's consider that for a moment. Who am I? For ostensibly a Buddhist, some Buddhists would say, well, that's not okay, that's a Hindu meditation. But who is mindful of the Buddha, that's okay. So, if somebody could tell me the difference between asking, who am I, and investigating that, and investigating who is being mindful of the Buddha, and can show me a difference between the two, I would like to know what that difference is. First of all, the emphasis is not on the Buddha, and it's not on I, it's on who. So whether you're asking who am I, or who is being mindful of the Buddha, you can't escape the fact that in either case, it's self-inquiry. So there are those who find it disturbing that's self-inquiry. The term self-inquiry implies a self, and the Buddha taught no self. Well, what is this no self that we're talking about? Is it just the counterpositive of self, like the flip side of a coin? Well, that's a big question. Is it a question of semantics, linguistic preferences? If we say no self, is that no self mean a implicative negation? Does it imply a self that we're negating? Because we are saying no self. Or is it an absolute negation, or a non-implicative negation, where you're negating but not implying anything? So briefly, the difference between an implicative negation and a non-implicative negation is very simple to explain. If I say, John's not eating, that just means exactly what it says. John's not eating. It could be for the rest of his life, we don't know. But John's not eating doesn't imply anything. It negates the fact that he's eating. And it doesn't imply anything. But if we say John's not eating in the morning, well, that implies that he's eating in the afternoon or in the evening. So it's an implicative negation. So when we say no self, Buddhists say there's no self. Is that a non-implicative negation? Well, yes, that's what the Buddhists say. So the trick is to really believe that and have no self, no mark of self, as it says in the sutras. the Prajnaparamita Sutras that talk about no mark of self, other living beings in a lifespan. But how do we get there? Well, you get there by asking yourself, who am I? Or you can say, who is being mindful of Buddha? But you can't get around the fact by just saying, well, there's no self. Well, who's doing the investigation? Obviously, there is something sitting there doing the investigation. So what's being negated? Are you negating the investigator and saying, well, there's nobody investigating, therefore there's no self? And as soon as the meditation is over, run off and get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something and talk about no self. So it's not so easy as just saying there is no self. And that, or there is a self. What do we mean by self? If you ask an enlightened person, whether Hindu or Buddhist, he may just say there's no self or other. He may identify with all living beings as himself, and not separate from others. He may feel others' desires as his own desires, others' fears as his own fears, others' love as his own love, others' compassion as his own compassion, others' joy as his own joy. When we see no self, we trump around saying there is no self. It's not so easy to deny that. You have to predicate it with something. No personal self. Yes. Is there a Buddha? Is there the Buddha nature? Is that the self? If there's a Buddha nature, why do I feel that an individual, my own personal needs, my own desires? Who do those desires belong to? Do they belong to my Buddha nature? Do they belong to the Buddha within me? What is this self that's getting between the Buddha and I? What comes between the Buddha and I? How do I get together with my Buddha nature? How can anyone say that asking who am I is different from asking who is being mindful of the Buddha? As soon as you start the dialogue with yourself, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, it all goes out the window. It all depends on your inquiry and the sincerity of your motivation to inquire. And by the way, Buddhists don't altogether deny a self. Some will say there's a Buddha nature, a all-pervasive awareness, a commonality amongst all of us, which is the Buddha nature. So if you identify that with that as yourself, then your little personal self, with your little personal desires and your personal fears and your personal wants, your personal cravings and your personal graspings, that self becomes very, 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 very small. And it dissolves into a far greater awareness of a greater sense of self that's not separate from others, not separate from the Buddha nature, not separate from pure awareness. So saying that there is no self in Buddhism does that imply then that there's no Buddha nature? So, is it an absolute negation? Or does it imply that maybe there's no personal self? No self that we generally associate or limit ourselves by, and that we are obstructed by, that we are tangled up in. Is it no self mean that we're not the personal self? Maybe so. But you never find out if you don't ask, who am I? And if you prefer, you can ask, who is being mindful of the Buddha? But you must inquire. And you must ask and take the journey inside. And little by little, go deeper and deeper. And feel a brotherliness, sisterliness, and oneness with all living beings. And stop thinking all thoughts of self and no self. These are just concepts that we have in our mind and that we hold on to and predicate Buddhists with no self. Predicate Hinduism with self, like that we're talking about a boogeyman or something. It all comes down to words, descriptions. And those words and descriptions are very nice for intellect to hold on to and think that they mean something. But if one guru tells you there's no self, if you ask and you say, is there a self or no self? And one guru says, yes, there is self. Another guru says, no, there's no self. Both will mean exactly the same thing to you, to anyone, until you find out for yourself through experience but that question itself is completely ridiculous and it can't be answered. It's just how you approach the issue. And you can both be right. In ultimate, from the depth of your deep realization, you can say there's a self, or you can say there's no self. Just like a quantum physicist can say light is in packets, and another quantum physicist can say, no, light is a wave. And in fact, they're both right. And we know that now through advances in science. And it comes down to how the experiment is done. So as far as how your inquiry takes you to achieve self-realization and call whatever you arrive at self, or you take self-realization and call whatever you arrive at no self. As long as it's self-realization, what difference does it make? Whether light comes in packets or it comes in waves, it's still light. It illumines. It illumines the eyes and mind and the forms and everything we see. So, self-inquiry is a great joy. And it's a great joy because you can find out who you are. And you find out by eliminating who you are not. And little by little negate this and negate that and negate that and negate that and negate that. And what remains that cannot be negated is obviously who you are. And you're not going to have a mind to talk about it